In the previous section of the video, we looked at several objections to classical utilitarianism that create some fairly serious problems for the theory with respect to its plausibility. And so now we'll look at the contemporary responses from consequentialist theorists that have been made to create a more plausible form of consequentialism. So the first response that we'll look at is the development of rule consequentialism. As we know, classical utilitarianism is an act consequentialist theory. That is, it specifically evaluates each action for its ability to maximize utility, or as utility is defined, overall good produced by an action. So looking at each individual action, as we noted on Tuesday, can become very cumbersome and difficult to actually apply. We're constantly going to have to be calculating the outcomes of our behavior, and again, possibly without very much success. So rule consequentialism doesn't address the fact that we may not even be able to accurately measure value to begin with, and that we may not be aware of the consequences of certain kinds of actions to the extent that we would need to give a clear assessment of what would count as maximizing utility. But what it does do is address the fact that it seems highly impractical to attempt to evaluate every single action in that way. We can, in a fairly well-considered manner, look at which rules would, if everyone followed them, maximize utility in general. So in that case, we would look at the kinds of actions that diminish the overall amount of happiness in the world, and we would forbid those kinds of actions. And then we would look at the kinds of actions that tend to promote the overall amount of happiness in the world, and we would either require or at least encourage those types of actions by having a set of rules that says we should do the things that promote goodness, we should not do the things that promote badness, in a fairly simplistic way of explaining the theory. Now, what this does is, in addition to addressing the practical problem of constant calculation, it also addresses the theoretical problems associated with demandingness and deontological constraints that we already discussed. Namely, in looking at demandingness, if we just have a set of rules, we can say, I'm going to follow these rules, and we don't have to then go constantly evaluate whether or not our action could do even more good, and therefore be in a position to never have a limit to what's required to us. Having a set of rules can impose a limit on what's required of us in a meaningful way. In order to address the deontological constraints, right, we can make rules that demand respecting persons, and that at their core focus on the need to respect persons. And so we can say we're not going to kill people in order to promote the overall well-being of everyone. And so we can get around the types of cases that were given as rights violations or cases of lack of respect for persons. So the argument is that in doing so, we're able to get around the kinds of theoretical criticisms, as well as some of the practical ones that have been given regarding classical utilitarianism. As we'll see in class when we discuss, there are, of course, several problems with rule consequentialism, including the possibility that because it's still a consequentialist theory, ultimately looking at consequences is going to be the most important thing. And if we had to jettison the rules completely in order to maximize utility, it seems like that would still be required. So next, we're going to look at satisficing consequentialism. So one of the strategies that Timmons discusses that's taken by contemporary consequentialists in response to theoretical concerns is that they might eliminate one of the features of classical utilitarianism that makes it problematic and makes it subject to criticism. And so in the case of satisficing consequentialism, the requirement that gets eliminated is the maximizing requirement. And so, of course, right, we discussed the fact that maximizing especially produces very strongly a problem for the issue of demandingness. It eliminates the possibility of doing something that's considered above and beyond our duty, because no matter what, we always have to do whatever produces the best consequences. And so the principle that Timmons gives to represent this theory is that an action A performed in circumstances C is morally right, not wrong, if and only if and because the utility of A meets or exceeds the specified threshold utility. In cases where A is below the threshold but has the highest utility among one's options, then A is morally required. So basically, right, what this means is that we set a basic minimum of the amount of goodness that would count for an action to be considered moral, to be considered right, that we do it. And then we say, you're always required to do at least that much good. You can go above and beyond, but then we have a concept of going above and beyond that we have access to in that case. And of course, it recognizes that there are some instances where the minimum threshold of utility is simply not attainable. We're really choosing among the least bad option among many instead of the very best option among many, or a sufficiently decent option among many. This, in the case of, very difficult circumstances, may be a situation where there is no real decent option for action, and in that case, then maximizing within those horrible circumstances would still be required. But it wouldn't produce a problem of demandingness, because it's really just saying, well, this time we just need to mitigate the bad as best we can. Whereas it's the requirement that we always produce more good if possible that produces the demandingness objection. And so satisficing consequentialism is one way of addressing that objection. And again, we'll look at some possible concerns even for satisficing consequentialism in our discussion in class. So the other theory that Timmons discusses is the value pluralist consequentialism. And the particular form that he discusses chooses to eliminate more than one of the features of classical utilitarianism. Now, it's possible that we wouldn't have to use this precise kind of theory, and that we could nonetheless move away from the hedonistic account of well-being. So we already talked about the fact that there is objectivist theory, or what Timmons is calling an objective theory of value, that we can apply to a consequentialist framework to get a probably more satisfying result than simple hedonism or desire satisfaction theories. But the other thing that this particular form of value pluralist consequentialism does is, in addition to getting rid of that hedonist account, it eliminates the impartialist criterion of classical utilitarianism. So it does allow us to weigh certain individuals over others, which in some cases is pretty important. On the one hand, it keeps universalism, so we still have to consider the consequences for everyone. But it allows us to consider the needs of some people to be more pressing and more likely to produce more value than addressing the needs of certain other people. So in the cases of diminishing marginal utility, it allows us to weigh in favor of those who are worse off, but also in the cases of vulnerable persons, it gives us the ability to account for the fact that we do have some preference for those who are vulnerable. And finally, it allows us a certain amount of partiality in relation to kind of proximity and personal connection to other individuals, in the sense of, for example, special obligations to our fellow citizens or to our family members, which were discussed in the demandingness objections. What's important to note here, though, too, is that there's a particular set of values that this type of value pluralist consequentialism promoted by Brink is looking at. So we could say that we need to balance and weigh courses of action based on different kinds of value they produce, right? So the values that are being taken into account by Brink are the values of pursuing meaningful personal projects and then realizing those valuable projects, as well as the value of developing and maintaining personal and social relationships. And so those are the types of value that he recommends. We can, of course, as a class, collectively discuss other types of value that we think a value pluralist consequentialism might be better to take on. But in this case, those are the criteria of value. And so the actions that you undertake then in this account are those personal projects, both the pleasure of pursuing them and the pleasure of realizing them. So for example, if you're an artist and you're painting something, you're probably in general enjoying the act of painting, right? The process of pursuing that goal. And then when you complete a project, there's a satisfaction of having completed a project that's meaningful to you. And of course, many of the objections to consequentialism have been based on the influence they might have on maintaining personal relationships and being able to attend to those meaningful personal and social relationships. And so that's a value that, of course, has to be balanced with one's own individual concerns of pursuing and realizing those projects of value. Now, there are several concerns that Timmons states about Brink's theory, and so we will also discuss those collectively as a class.